Good evening and welcome. You're watching India Today's live and continuing coverage of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the United States, his first bilateral meeting with President Trump since he became president again. It was a day with highs and lows. Bonhomie, also the threat of new tariffs. Over the next 2 hours, some of the biggest names in India-America ties will be joining us for their insights on the key takeaways from this, the first bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. I'm Rahul, Kanwal. Trade and tariffs dominated the Modi-Trump talks as they met in Washington, D.C. While President Trump spoke of reciprocal tariffs, the Prime Minister spoke of keeping national interest first. Over the next hour, we will break down the Trump tariff talk, but first, a recap of what happened when PM Modi met Donald Trump.
Even as Prime Minister Narendra Modi landed in Washington, D.C. for his two-day trip to the United States, US President Donald Trump was coming through on the threats he issued a week ago. After slapping duties on imports from his three biggest trading partners, China, Canada and Mexico, after imposing duties on steel and aluminium imports, Trump dragged India into his crosshairs by imposing tit-for-tat tariffs across the board.
The reciprocal makes tariffs really fair. It's a beautiful, simple system, and we don't have to worry about, gee, we're charging too much or too little. But traditionally, India is right at the top of the pack, pretty much. There are a couple of smaller countries that are actually more, but India is a they charge tremendous tariffs.
Trump, the eternal deal maker, kept up the pressure on India, raising the issue again twice in the presence of Prime Minister Modi. First, during their bilateral talks, and again at the joint press conference.
We announced some very big elements today of success. I call it an element of success. Reciprocal tariffs, so that somebody charges us, we charge them the same amount, which has never been done in our country before. We've always been taken advantage of by other countries, and we allowed that to happen foolishly, but we're not going to allow that any longer. It's hard to sell into India because they have trade barriers, very strong tariffs. We are right now a reciprocal nation. We are going to, if it's India or if it's somebody else with low tariffs, we're going to have the same. We're going to have whatever India charges, we're charging them. Whatever another country charges, we're charging them. So it's called reciprocal.
The impact on the Indian stock markets was as expected. Though the indices opened in green, they were later dragged down by the possible repercussions of the trade war on Indian industry and the resulting uncertainty among foreign portfolio investors. The Nifty is down nearly 900 points in the past 8 sessions.
Not only Indian, but world over, the investors are nervous. They are not sure which way the global economy will move with these kind of new tariff and what kind of disruption it can bring to these overall global supply chains.
The reciprocal tariff, however, failed to cast a shadow on the Modi-Trump meetings, with both leaders taking off again on the ties they enjoyed more than 4 years ago. India already has an import duty cut in the offing and is likely to trim its trade surplus with the US with more crude oil, gas and defense imports. Prime Minister Modi also alleviated some of the trade tensions in his trademark style.
अमेरिका की भाषा में कहूं तो विकसित भारत का मतलब मेक इंडिया ग्रेट अगेन, यानी मीगा। जब अमेरिका और भारत साथ मिलकर काम करते हैं, यानी मागा, मागा प्लस मीगा, तब बन जाता है मेगा पार्टनरशिप फॉर प्रॉस्पेरिटी।
Meanwhile, US and Indian officials are also moving forward with talks on a bilateral trade deal, with the Trump administration official saying they hope to have a deal in place this year. Bureau Report, Business Today TV.
Since so much of the focus of the bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and American President Donald Trump has been on tariffs, I want to put this whole debate about trade tariffs into perspective. And I'll take you through some charts which really give you a sense of what's at play. We'll first look at the tariffs, the weighted mean tariffs that India imposes on products imported from the United States and what the US imposes on products imported from India. So what you see in the green line above are the average tariffs that India puts on products brought in from the US, and the blue line is the line which indicates the tariffs that America applies on products imported from India. So American tariffs have been relatively low all through. They're currently at about 3%. India's average weighted tariffs before the budget stood at about 9.5. Post the budget, this would come down to 8.5, but stood at 9.5. So there's a big gap of about 6% on the average weighted tariffs that India applies on products which we import from the United States and the tariffs that the US applies on products which are imported from India, it is this gap of 6.5% that is the cause of irritation for Donald Trump, and he wants to change it. He says, "Jitna aap lagaoge, utna main lagaunga." You know, there are some research studies that say of all the countries, India could potentially be the most impacted if these reciprocal tariffs that Donald Trump spoke about in that press conference yesterday afternoon are implemented. Now, we know for a fact that the new US Commerce Secretary and our Commerce and Industry Minister, Piyush Goyal, will very quickly get into talks. Robert Lutnick, we're waiting for him to be ratified by the US Senate. But till then, this is where things stand. So if there is no change between now and the 2nd of April, and if Trump does push through on his threat to implement tariffs in the way that he's announced, potentially India could face tariffs up to 29%. Brazil could come in second at 28%, EU at 25%, the UK at 24%, Mexico at 23%, Canada at 19%, Korea at 13%, Taiwan at 12%, Singapore at 9%. So India could potentially, which is why when he sees charts like this, Donald Trump concludes that India is the tariff king or is abusing tariffs. And therefore, if nothing changes between now and April, India could have the maximum impact of these reciprocal trade tariffs. I'll try and show this in a comparison to give you a sense of what really to expect, at least on the basis of the way trade data stands at the moment. And that's the third chart coming up on your screen right now. The tariffs that we apply versus tariffs that the United States applies. So here is our trade deficit. This again is a big cause of concern for Donald Trump. But remember, relative to, say, a country like China, China has a $295 billion trade surplus with the US, which means they export $295 billion worth more than they import. The euro area, again, taken together, a big trade abuser from Trump's lens. So is Mexico and Vietnam. India is relatively less, at number 9. You know, then there's Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Canada. India has a $45.7 billion surplus. This is what Donald Trump is seeking to extract. And Prime Minister Modi's promise is that we could buy more energy, oil from you. We could potentially also buy more defense purchases from you. And if that happens, that $45 billion surplus could go. Basically, what Trump is trying to play at is to get India to buy more oil and more defense purchases, because that's the fastest way of dealing with this. I'll take you through some categories of tariffs. For example, India's average tariff on all products is about 9.5 on US products, whereas the US tariff on Indian products is 3. So this is the 6.5% gap we spoke about. Let's now go through some products where the gaps are bigger. For example, on dairy products. And this is logical from India's perspective because there are lots of small dairy farmers. Minister Piyush Goyal, Prime Minister Modi, Nirmala Sitharaman, they need to take care of our small dairy farmers. Therefore, we impose high tariffs on products imported from the US. The US doesn't like that. On fruits and vegetables, India's tariffs are 132. The US too has high tariffs, 120. India, in fact, pushing for the ability to export more, say, mangoes to the US. That, again, has been a bone of contention. This is cereals and food preparations. India's tariff 193%, America's 150. Here, again, a gap between the tariffs imposed by India versus the tariffs imposed by the United States. I'll take you through a few more product categories, beverages and tobacco on your screen right now, where it's the same. India doesn't want too much imported from the US, neither does the US. On minerals and metals, though, a big differential. India's average tariff 187, America's about 40. So a gap here between the tariffs imposed by India on American products and what America charges. India has far fewer import duties on chemicals. American import duties are much higher. So it's not as if India is higher on all categories. In categories like transport equipment, for example, India's import tariffs on US products only 50% versus 125% imposed by the United States. So this is a broad sense of why Trump is angry. He's a deal maker, a businessman. He wants to change it and he says, okay, tum lagao, main lagao. Reciprocal tariffs. That's his new economic warfare brahmastra, which he threatens to unleash on countries like India. The irksome thing, of course, is that it happened at a time when the Indian Prime Minister was on DC. So a rather ill-timed press conference from an Indian lens. But from a Trumpian lens, that's the point he wishes to make. That's the message he wishes to send. To talk about this, I'm joined live from Washington, D.C. by Dr. Mukesh Aghi. He's the President and Chief Executive at the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, worked very closely on trying to bring the Modi-Trump bilateral agenda together. Dr. Aghi, thank you for taking out time and joining us. You were with us, and you're in fact amongst the first people who said that reciprocal tariffs will target all nations. India is not going to get any kind of an exemption. It went exactly as per the script you laid out on the NewsTrack last evening. Now, he's announced these tariffs. He's also said this will happen on the 2nd of April. That creates this window between Valentine's Day and the start of a new financial year. Is there enough love in the India-America relationship to be able to come to a bilateral trade agreement in this short period?
Rahul, thank you. One is the meeting which took place between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump was much broader. I know we were focused on tariff. We focused a lot on energy security. We focused a lot on technology innovation. We focused a lot on basically defense aspect and also trade and investment. But more important, we have to understand that Trump sees nations on the trade deficit and trade surplus. India does have a trade surplus of around $45 billion, as you mentioned. And I think that can be addressed very, very quickly by shifting India's procurement of energy to the United States. And I believe that within 12 months, that deficit will go away. Now, in regards to tariff, it is important to understand, yes, India does have a higher tariffs, but they also announced a focus of trying to take in the trade between the two countries of $500 billion. They also announced a more of a bilateral trade agreement. Reduce the tariff, bring in more movement of goods itself. So I believe that, I think, yes, tariff is an issue, but it is not a game stopper. It is more important to understand is we need to get focused on getting by fall, when President Trump comes to India, some kind of a trade agreement, and we can pick it up from the one which we had defined in the first Trump 1.0 mini trade deal. Just expand on that. And so we have enough time to take that forward. Now, in regards to his directive yesterday, as far as the tariff, reciprocal tariff, is more of a study being done, and it will get implemented. But I think it also gives leeway to him to delay that if we can focus on getting the trade agreement signed between the two countries.
Okay, you saw the Biden-Modi visit. You saw now the Trump-Modi visit the first time round and the second time round. How do you compare these bilateral visits? I mean, of course, the Biden visit was a state visit, much more pomp and show, a state dinner, the big party out in the White House lawns. All of that was missing. This was a working visit, and the fact that Trump chose to do the press conference hours before the Prime Minister came, was that really a negotiating tactic by President Trump to put pressure on the Indian side?
Well, you have to understand, for Trump, tariff threat is a negotiating ploy. And we've seen that happening with Canada, with Mexico, and other countries. Yes, I think this was announced almost a week ago that I will focus on reciprocal. And by design or by coincidence, he basically signed the directive, not an executive order, but a directive to go study how each country is imposing tariff on the U.S. and how we reciprocate. But to answer your bigger question, I think when you compare the Biden state visit and the Trump visit, there were more substance in this visit. There were much more business-focused aspect of the relationship. They said, we will take our trade to $500 billion by 2030. We will go look for signing a bilateral trade agreement by fall of this year. So there were milestones and timelines set up in every category, from research to defense to procurement to scientific partnership. So I think this had much more substance. And I calculated roughly 70, 80 different potential agreements will be signed between now and the fall. So you will see the momentum picking up between the two countries, both from a geopolitical perspective, from a defense perspective, from a scientific research perspective. And I've talked to US companies and the CEOs. They're very excited that India will now have a more market access for US companies and also a level playing field. So I think it's a win-win value proposition. Yes, we will have some speed bumps, but there is enough strong relationship between the two leaders that they can overcome those speed bumps.
Dr. Mukesh Aghi, for joining us from DC, thank you very much. I want to go across now to Taranjeet Sandhu. Taranjeet Sandhu is now a member of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Before this, he was India's ambassador to the United States. He's an expert on everything that happens on Capitol Hill, understands the India-America relationship than most people. Thank you very much, Mr. Sandhu, for joining us. You know, you were on the ground when we met you at your residence in DC when Prime Minister Modi was meeting with President Biden. How do you compare that visit, that was a state visit, with this more working visit between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump? Donald Trump seems this time round to be very transactional. The jappis are less effusive. It's more business-like. He's putting America first and not caring as much about his friends.
So I don't know, Rahul, if the jaffis were less, but you look at, see it from 2014 onwards. Prime Minister Modi came first time in 2014, then 2015, then 2016. But there was a change of administration in 2017. And there was also a change of administration in 2021. And again, there's a change of administration in 2025. I think the timing itself speaks. It's a bipartisan relationship and it has developed. And as my friend Mukesh was saying, I think the joint statement speaks about clearly about 6 areas. And this has been a steady progress. So defense, investment, trade, energy security, technology innovation, multilateral cooperation, people-to-people ties. So that has been developed. But the significance of this visit certainly is that it's early in President Trump's second tenure and within 3 to 4 weeks. And it's a great opportunity. Look, their equation is very good. And that helps to undertake a candid conversation and to have the discussion on number of these issues. And some of them Mukesh also alluded to.
So you were ambassador when that whole agreement for GE 404 turbo afterburn engines was signed. Now, since then, we actually haven't received those engines, leading to Indian defense commentators questioning the reliability and trustworthiness of America as a defense supplier. President Trump offered the F-35 stealth fighters, which is a significant offer in terms of a weapon purchase, but there's no talk of any transfer of technology. And even in the engines which were promised to us, we're still waiting.
So, Rahul, I don't want to compare, but, you know, in United States, it's the private sector, unlike Russia, where it is the state organizations which are running it. You are aware that during the COVID, there has been a major supply chain problem. And one of the issues discussed this time was also reliable supply chain, which incidentally, there was a term coined and really pushed by Trump in his first phase due to the COVID at that time. So this aspect has been brought to the attention of US administration. And I know that the senior people there, you know, there are a number of negotiating issues. You saw one of the earlier Trump 1.0 deputy assistants to the president in her interview. She mentioned that it took 7 years for an agreement which was a promise which was made. You know, there are procedures and processes. So I'm sure this has been flagged in the conversations. And if you look at the defense aspect this time, there are a number of issues. In fact, the 10-year, now what we talk of the framework, is due this year. And they are saying that it will be much more innovative. And they are also going to be looking at top of the line, because ultimately, remember, we require defense equipment, and you know why we require top of the line equipment. And that, I think, ultimately it's the market which decides, and we have to take a call on that. And certainly United States in this joint statement has underlined the 5th generation aircraft, etc., which will be offered.
Okay, I leave it there. Taranjit Singh Sandhu for joining us. Thank you. Former Indian ambassador, very recently in DC, explaining his thoughts. I want to go across now to a man on the ground. Rohit Sharma joins us from Washington, DC. He covered the visit all through the night. In fact, he was in the White House when the questions were being asked and that press conference happened, a very rare press conference for the Indian Prime Minister, one of the very few he's done since he became Prime Minister. Rohit, how was it? Describe the atmospherics, the mood in the room, and we've seen the headlines. Give us a sense of what it was like to be on the ground then.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Rahul. So first things first, it was, the entire visit was under the shadow of tariff. From morning when President Trump posted that tweet or posted that message on Truth Social saying that he was going to sign that directive executive order. But all in all, I think once it was clear that he's not going to be announcing tariff, he's going to just have a directive to have these reports ready by April 2nd, and then they will probably give some leeway to the Indian side to make an agreement on trade. I think it kind of shifted, towards the other aspects of the visit, which included, and as Prime Minister Modi and President Trump talked about during their press conference, it ranged from talking about Bangladesh to China to Russia to increasing trade to buying more natural gas from the United States. And then, leaving a lot of things to the Prime Minister, when he was asked about certain things on who's the strong person, who's a strong negotiator. You saw that bromance from Donald Trump, where he went on and said, there's no competition with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. He's a very strong negotiator. And we saw the same thing and same camaraderie from Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We saw the handshake, we saw the hug, the fact that they were able to, President Trump saying that I missed you as soon as he saw Prime Minister Narendra Modi. So that was on the display for everybody to see. Also, the fact that Prime Minister, reminded President Trump that his nation is his interest, saying that I believe in Make India Great Again, and as you believe in Make America Great Again, and together we can do a lot of things. So I think it was a warm visit, definitely overshadowed initially by the trade and tariffs. But overall, I think in the 32 hours that Prime Minister Modi was in DC, starting his visit by meeting Tulsi Gabbard and then the incoming NSA Walls and Musk, I think it was a very substantial meeting.
Rohit Sharma, thank you for joining us. I'll slip into a break. When we come back, I have two very special guests joining me. I'll have Ashley Tellis, undisputedly one of the top experts on India-America ties. He's seen the whole arc of India-America relationship right from the 90s to now. So he'll give us a historical context. I'll have Lisa Curtis join us. Lisa Curtis was in the first Trump administration. She understands the inner workings of the American government and the implications for India. Later, we'll also be looking at the offer of the F-35 fighter jets to India. Should India consider this seriously? Can it be a game changer, or are they just too costly? Details on the world's deadliest fighter now being available for sale to India, coming up on the other side of a quick break. Stay with us. I want to go across now, live and exclusive to Washington, D.C., where I'm joined by a special guest, arguably America's top India expert. We're joined by Ashley Tellis. He served in the National Security Council staff as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Strategic Planning in Southwest Asia. He helped bring together the India-America nuclear deal. And very few people have seen the whole arc of evolution of India-America ties from as close quarters as Ashley Tellis has. So, Mr. Tellis, for taking out time on an important day, thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
I want to start by asking you, Mr. Tellis, about your key takeaways from that joint statement. There's so much talk about just the visual spectacle, but you've been through the details with a very fine-tooth comb. From your lens, what's the message Prime Minister Modi and President Trump are sending to each other's countries and to the rest of the world in the formal joint statement that was put out at the end of the visit?
So let me start by identifying what I thought was the primary objective of Prime Minister Modi's visit. It was essentially to convince President Trump that India was a great partner for the United States and that India shared in the success of his ambitions. And by doing so, I think he also wanted to gain a measure of immunity from Trump's more problematic policies, especially in the area of trade. My judgment, after watching a day and a half of interactions here in DC, is that the Prime Minister succeeded magnificently on all counts. In fact, I think it was a Modi makes magic visit because it's very hard to disarm a personality like President Trump, but just watching their interactions during the presser after the day's conversations, I think he had achieved exactly what he set out to do.
Why do you feel this way? Because the other way of looking at this, which is the perspective the Indian opposition is putting out, is that it's a bit embarrassing for Prime Minister Trump to be in DC on the day that these reciprocal tariffs are announced in a press conference. In the press conference, he repeatedly picks on India, repeats that in the presence of Prime Minister Modi. Is that, from your lens, just a negotiating tactic, or are we seeing this time a less warm, a less effusive, more transactional, more business-like Donald Trump?
No, I think there are some things that are Trump's fixations which are not going to go away. Tariffs are one of those. And India is going to get tarred by those tariffs no matter what. But I think the space has now opened up for a negotiation. The commitments that India has made to buy additional US defense equipment, to create greater market access for US commodities. These are the things that, ring like music in Trump's ears. And so we've not heard the last of this. So think of this as a process that is occurring in parallel. In general, Trump is going to pursue a tariffs-heavy economic policy that is going to be aimed at the global trading system. But he will be willing to make deals individually with countries based on what he sees as their importance to US interests. And I think India is clearly now in that category. I mean, it always was, but it's wonderful to see Trump acknowledging that. And I think he was very, very clear on that point, that he sees India as a partner on a whole range of issues. And the joint statement, I think, elaborates that in great detail.
They've also spoken of the F-35 stealth fighter jet being offered to India. Now, this is prohibitively costly. There's no talk of transfer of technology in these stealth fighters. You were involved personally in the nuclear deal. Do you think this is something that India should be considering, given the geostrategic considerations? Or do you think that we'd much rather be better off with a country like France, or a more reliable defense partner? And why I say this is because there was so much fanfare around the GE 404 engines being offered to India during President Biden's visit. Ultimately, we still are waiting for those engines. So how reliable is America as a defense supplier to India? We've got a history of insecurity with American supplies. The recent experience isn't very heartening either.
Well, I think the offer to supply F-35s eventually, and I emphasize the word eventually because President Trump went out of his way to say this is a pathway to the eventual offering of an F-35. I think that is a symbol of Mr. Trump's willingness to put things on the table that previously were off the table. But whether it is the answer to India's challenges where it comes to its air power deficits, I think requires more examination. There are some things that I think one can be confident about. I think it would be very hard to agree to co-producing F-35s in India. I mean, the technology is something that the United States guards very zealously. We've done co-production agreements with only a very few US allies, and those agreements were done at the beginning of the program. As you point out, the aircraft is expensive. There will be all kinds of security and monitoring issues involved if there is actually a sale of the aircraft, monitoring that India may not feel particularly comfortable with. So I think, there are issues that still have to be resolved if India decides to go in that direction. There's also the larger question, and I think you were hinting about that in your question. And that larger question is, can India integrate the F-35 in its Air Force, given that it has already now gone down the path of acquiring Rafales for its medium combat aircraft role? Where would the F-35 fit into the Indian Air Force's force structure? These are all issues that I think we will have an opportunity to discuss in times to come. But I see the F-35 offer as a symbol that is intended to convey to India that the US will not be unwilling to offer it the best defense technology possible.
Interesting. Let's now talk about the trade deal that clearly talks have to begin very soon. There's a window till the 2nd of April, after which the tariffs could come into play. Do you think there's enough time, given the fact that the Commerce Secretary hasn't yet been ratified? That's still a work in progress. There was talk and negotiation on a limited trade deal, which ran into trouble the last time. India has very serious concerns about the import of agricultural products, dairy products, which are big asks from the United States. If Robert Lighthizer and Piyush Goyal couldn't resolve it the last time round, how do you view the probability of being able to get a trade deal going, a bilateral trade agreement going in this month and a half between now and the 2nd of April?
I think it is going to be tough. There's no question about it. And it's not only the issues at commerce, it's also USTR, which I presume, the US Trade Representative's Office, which I presume will take the lead in these negotiations. So getting a deal that has involved very, very sticky challenges in the past, by the time April rolls around, I think may be hard. But the important thing is this, to my mind. The negotiation should begin in earnest, and there should be clear evidence that both sides are negotiating in good faith. And if we can at least put those building blocks on the table before April, then I think there may be ways in which India can be afforded some waivers before the universal tariff regime comes into play.
President Trump indicated that apart from Tahavur Rana, he'd be willing to consider, and we have a list of at least 12 most wanted people who are in the United States. Do you see there being a marked difference in the tolerance seen in the Biden administration to anti-India operatives who are residing happily on US soil and the way the Trump government views it? Or do you see there not being much of a difference?
I think Trump clearly wants to be as cooperative as possible with India, but the structural challenges are still going to remain, right? If these individuals are US citizens, then it gets extremely complicated because the executive branch simply cannot, extradite individuals without the courts having a say in the matter and so on and so forth. If these are non-US citizens, then I think it's a different story. So I think that issue will have to be examined on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, let's also speak of the personal bonhomie and the fact that President Trump invited Prime Minister Modi so early on in his term. So we've seen the Prime Minister of Israel, we've seen the Prime Minister of Japan, we've seen the King of Jordan amongst those who've come. How much, because there's a big debate in India about whether it's the right thing to go so early in your visit, because one perspective is he barely got any time with the American president. He went there last evening. President Trump kind of kept him hanging till the afternoon, met him only at 3 o'clock. There was no state dinner. It didn't have the pomp and show of the last visit. The other, which is the Jaishankar point, is to get in there early. Get in there early, make your point, get some mind space. Which of the two do you think in the end turned out to be the right strategy?
Well, I think Minister Jaishankar's calculation was spot on. Given the mercurial quality of President Trump's administration and the behaviors that have been adopted so far, I think it served India's interests better to be in the queue early, to be helping to define what the contours of the engagement would be, not only immediately, but over the long term. And I think it really helped, this visit really helped to get Trump to focus on India's value for US interests. And I think he mentioned that a couple of times in the presser. So I am tempted to conclude that this was actually the smart thing to do. There will always be opportunities for future engagements, right? The president has committed to visiting India for the Quad Leaders Summit sometime later this year. There will be an intense round of bilateral agreements on discussions on trade, on defense, and so on and so forth. But the point is to get leader level attention very early on, I think is always a smart play. And I'm glad that India made it.
Ashley, tell us for taking out time and joining us. Thank you. I'm going now to arguably, again, one of the top experts on India-America ties, Lisa Curtis. She was part of the first Trump administration, now a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. You can't get better than Lisa Curtis and Ashley Tellis speaking one after another. Two very rich insights there. Thank you very much, Ms. Curtis, for joining us. I want your key takeaways for an Indian audience from this first bilateral meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the re-elected President Trump.
Well, I think it was a successful meeting. The fact that it happened so early in the Trump administration is very notable. It shows the emphasis and importance of India to the United States. And you could really see from the press spray, from the press conference, that there is a warm friendship between the two leaders that very much came across, their mutual respect for one another. And then if you look at the very lengthy joint statement and all of the wide-ranging agreements that were made, I think it's very clear that the U.S.-India relationship is off to a very good start under this second Trump administration. There was an emphasis on military cooperation. They talked about the co-production of Javelin missiles and Stryker combat vehicles. They talked, the U.S. even opened the door for India to potentially buy the F-35 aircraft, very high-end technology, something that India would very much be interested in. So I think, between everything that was discussed and the kind of warmth and respect that the two leaders showed for one another, I think we can, safely say that the relationship is off to a good start.
There's a lot of chatter in India about the timing of that Trump press conference on tariffs, given the fact that you have a visiting head of state. Just hours before you meet him, you do a press conference where, apart from threatening reciprocal tariffs against all countries in particular, he repeatedly mentioned India in that press conference, calling it tariff abuser. That doesn't really set the stage. I mean, in terms of optics, those aren't ideal optics, Lisa Curtis. Almost as if he's using tariffs as a negotiating, bargaining tactic to put the visiting dignitary down. Or at least that's the effort.
Well, this is the way that Trump operates. He operated in the same fashion in the first Trump administration. 24 to 48 hours before he would have a meeting with Prime Minister Modi, he would tweet out something about India's high tariffs. And I think this is a bit of a negotiating tactic that he likes to use. He likes to get out there with a very tough message and, threaten to retaliate or reciprocate, however you want to put it. So I don't think that is surprising. But you could also argue that, he got that issue out of the way. He sort of, made his point before the meeting. And so then, you could have a more positive engagement, interaction. He's already stated his case. He wants to see India reduce tariffs, and they have agreed to a trade negotiation. The question is, will the two sides be able to come to a trade deal?
So let's spend some time talking about it, given that Robert Lighthizer, Piyush Goyal were discussing, negotiating a limited trade agreement, and that came to naught in the first term. Now we have effectively a month and a half till the 2nd of April to be able to come to an agreement on a bilateral trade agreement. Given the differences in approach on issues like agricultural products, dairy products, and so many others, is there enough room, bandwidth, time, mind space to be able to get a trade deal done in this limited window?
Yeah, I think it's extremely ambitious. I would be very surprised if they could make a trade agreement within, the next several weeks. They couldn't do it in 4 years during the first Trump administration. I think, there's things India can do that will help narrow the trade deficit with the United States. Things like, importing more military equipment and importing more oil and gas. This will help, but it certainly, is not going to satisfy Trump. I think he really is looking for India to reduce tariffs on items that the U.S. exports to India, medical devices, agriculture items, and other things. So I think, really the pressure is on Prime Minister Modi and what he can do in terms of delivering some of these, reductions.
No, but some of this is undeliverable, if it were. For example, we've got the gap on dairy products, agricultural products on our screen right now. There is a big political constituency that Prime Minister Modi needs to deal with back home. There are millions of small dairy farmers in states like Gujarat, Maharashtra, elsewhere, who will be up in arms if India gets flooded with cheap dairy products or cheap American agricultural produce. It will be great for President Trump in his desire to make America great, but Prime Minister spoke about Indian national interests and the need to put them first from his lens.
Yeah, well, I think, we're going to see, again, I think the things that make President Trump and Prime Minister Modi respect each other, they have the same kind of leadership styles. They're really looking out for their own people, their own country. And, that's going to bump up against the idea of coming to some kind of fair trade agreement. So I think, we're going to see how much the trade issue impacts the overall strategic relationship, because frankly, there's a lot at stake when it comes to the U.S.-India overall relationship. And
you spoke of India importing more defense systems from the United States. I mean, the last big one was the GE 404 engines for the Indian light combat aircraft. That's still stuck up. I mean, so how can India trust America as a reliable weapon supplier, given our past history during the wars, and now even recently, so much hype and hoopla around the announcement, and then delayed delivery followed?
Yeah, I think the U.S. can make the same case. I was in the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, where we made the decision to allow India to have access to armed drone technology, the first non-NATO country to get such access. But it literally took 7 years to negotiate to complete the deal for the MQ-9s. So I think the U.S. can make the same argument that there's a lot of bureaucracy within the Indian system. It takes a long time to complete these major defense deals. So I think, each side has issues that make it difficult to...
No, but the counter to that is India doesn't really get preferential commercial rates. It's not as if there's a deep discount for a key ally, as would be the case with some other countries in terms of the pricing of those products. And for example, with the F-35, there's unlikely to be a transfer of technology or joint production, which again means you're spending all of that to buy off the shelf with no prospects of transfer of technology. And that would be difficult because, for example, India operates the S-400 missile defense systems, and that's something America would be uncomfortable with. So basically, unlike, say, the Rafale, where there is an element of joint production and production in India, technology transfer with a very expensive fighter jet like the F-35, that would be inconceivable, at least at this moment.
Yeah, well, of course, India is not an ally of the United States, but we still, would like to see more defense cooperation, more, co-production is also on the table for, like I said, the Javelin missiles, the Stryker combat vehicles, all of that's on the table, and it's going to be hard work. The U.S. will have to look at its technology transfer concerns. It will be looking at, how much has the Russians been able to penetrate the Indian military establishment? What does that mean for the safety of, U.S. technology that may be entering India? So there are so many questions and things that need to be worked out. And, I'm glad we're talking about these, because on the one hand, it was a very positive engagement, very, set the stage for the next 4 years. An ambitious agenda, to be sure. But, now we're talking about some of the realities of what, needs to get accomplished, and some of the obstacles that they're going to face in carrying these programs forward.
So they've spoken of India hosting the Quad Summit. If that happens at the head of state level, that will mean President Trump would be in India arguably sometime before fall, around fall. What do you see happen between now, February, and fall?
Well, yeah, I think a lot does have to happen. But first, let me point out that if Trump does indeed go to India this fall, that will be the first time that a U.S. president has, made the trek to India in his first year. So that's quite significant in and of itself. But it also means that the two sides need to work hard. They need to, prepare for a Quad summit. That takes a lot of work, figuring out what will be the deliverables, what will be, Trump's stamp on the Quad. Of course, it was President Trump that revived the Quad back in 2017. But now, what kind of new initiatives are they going to be working on, the four countries together? That's one thing. The second is, like we said, how are they going to push forward on these defense sales issues? What needs to happen here in the United States? How can India sort of prod its own defense bureaucracy on these issues? And third, on the trade issue, that's probably the most difficult. Our trade negotiator has not been confirmed. Jamieson Greer, I think he will be confirmed. But this, is something that, he has to get into place. They have to start these trade negotiations. So I think we're going to see a lot of back and forth between U.S. and Indian officials before this visit by Trump in the fall, which is only, a few months away.
Well, there's a lot that needs to get done, if at all it can get done, between a government that is extremely transactional in the United States and one in India which is determined to protect its national interests. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Lisa Curtis, for taking out time and joining us on an important day. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
One of the big takeaways from the Modi-Trump bilateral was the U.S. offer of F-35 fighter jets. The F-35 is a fifth-generation stealth fighter renowned for its ability to operate undetected at supersonic speeds. Will this prove to be a game-changer for the Indian Air Force? And more importantly, is India willing to buy these pricey fighters from America?
Big boost to India-US defense ties. The Donald Trump administration has offered to sell the F-35 fighter stealth fighter jets to India. F-35 Lightning II fighter jet is a fifth-generation stealth fighter renowned for its ability to operate undetected at supersonic speeds.
Starting this year, we'll be increasing military sales to India by many billions of dollars. We're also paving the way to ultimately provide India with the F-35 stealth fighters.
The United States is aiming at increasing military supplies to India.
भारत की डिफेंस प्रिपेयर्डनेस में अमेरिका की महत्वपूर्ण भूमिका है। स्ट्रैटेजिक और ट्रस्टेड पार्टनर के नाते हम जॉइंट डेवलपमेंट, जॉइंट प्रोडक्शन और ट्रांसफर ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजी की दिशा में सक्रिय रूप से आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। आने वाले समय में भी नई टेक्नोलॉजी और इक्विपमेंट हमारी क्षमता बढ़ाएंगे।
This proposal has sparked significant interest in New Delhi. India is yet to take the final call on Trump's proposal.
There is, in most cases, a request for proposals that is floated. There are responses to those. They are evaluated. I don't think with regard to the acquisition of an advanced aviation platform by India, that process has started as yet. So,
the Foreign Secretary clarified that the offer has been made by the US, but Indian Air Force will follow due process based on its air staff requirements, and a request for proposal is yet to be floated. F-35 fighter jet can be a game changer for air superiority with its advanced capabilities. US F-35 is the most lethal, survivable and connected stealth fighter which can operate at undetected supersonic speed. The fighter jet features cutting-edge avionics and a center fusion, making it superior to China's J-35A. But multiple questions remain, from the cost to the overall integration with the Russian and French systems, from S-400 missile defense systems to Su-30 MKI and the French Rafales. With Shivani Sharma, Bureau Report, India Today.
Does it make sense for India to buy the F-35 fighter jet, even if there's a long runway to actually get there? Or is it just too costly? And therefore, given that we've already invested in the Rafale fighter jet system, this is not something India should be looking at. Joining us for perspective, I have Brahma Chelani, one of India's leading strategic affairs experts. With us also on this broadcast is Pramit Pal Chaudhary, head of India practice at the Eurasia Group. I want to go across to Brahma first. Brahma, given the options on the table and the fact that the Indian Air Force Chief has publicly now spoken of the fact that we're running horribly behind schedule in terms of augmenting our fighter aircraft fleet, would you be looking at the F-35 as a relevant purchase for the Indian Air Force? Or do you think it's too costly, we can't trust the Americans, therefore we shouldn't think about it?
Well, first, the F-35 is still not on offer. Trump said ultimately it'll be offered to India. Ultimately means in the years to come. More importantly, we should not forget that India is today the world's largest arms importer. India alone makes up about 10% of the global trade in arms. This is a huge burden on the Indian economy. Weapons imports and oil and gas imports, these two are weighing India down. And I think the larger question that we need to ask ourselves is that in today's world, the main threats nations are facing, especially India, if you can look at the threats that India has faced since the turn of the century, since the Kargil War, these threats have been essentially unconventional in nature. Buying conventional weapon systems that cost a fortune, does that enhance India's security? Now that's a more fundamental question, because we have been investing so heavily in major conventional weapon systems that we have not done the basic thing, which is to upgrade our border security. Without border security, there can be no national security. If you look at all the problems that India has faced in the last 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, these problems have arisen because of lack of adequate border security. We need to do our basics. And I think investing more and more in conventional weapon systems, especially ones that are so costly, is something that we need to consider very carefully before investing more and more resources.
That's an important point to make, especially given the fact that on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, it's really the Russian infantry versus Ukraine armed drones. And if that's the nature of the battle, then do we really need to spend so much money on buying these F-35s? I want to go across to Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam. He's flown the MiG-21, he's flown the Mirage 2000s, he's a leading strategic analyst, military historian. Marshal Subramaniam, as a fighter pilot and from your lens, and you understand what the Indian Air Force lacks and needs, is it relevant for India to be thinking seriously about the offer made by the American president to eventually buy these F-35s? Or do you think it's a fancy toy, but that's not what we need?
So, thank you, Rahul, for having me on the show. Two things first here. As far as the clear and present danger for the Indian Air Force is its rapidly depleting offensive assets. And when I talk about offensive assets, I mean to say fighter squadrons, 30 and still going down. Is there a need for building conventional capability in today's context? I think I differ with Brahma over here. As long as the national strategic establishment suggests that India faces full spectrum threats that spread across the spectrum from the conventional spectrum to sub-conventional conflict, I think India has no choice but to continue building conventional capability, albeit with greater technology and greater emphasis on making leaner force structures. Now, as far as the F-35 is concerned, I think it's too early for the Indian Air Force to actually respond to this offer. And here I agree with Brahma that it's not really an offer as yet. The Indian Air Force would be very keenly watching as to what the fine print of the offer is. Please keep in mind that 19 Air Forces are already flying the F-35. Delivery schedules are on the line for each one of these countries. None of these countries have managed transfer of technology as far as the F-35 is concerned. There is no doubt that it's a state-of-the-art platform. And should the platform come into the Indian Air Force's inventory, it would be a huge fillip to the Indian Air Force's offensive capability. But having said that, let's get real. Let the offer come in. Let's see what's the fine print. What is TOT? Is there any element of indigenization? Are production lines going to be set up in India? Is the F-35 going to be a harbinger of things to come, in the sense, would it offer a platform for collaboration between the United States and India for a sixth-generation fighter? These are the kind of issues that are extremely important to mull over before one can, go
sure,
to the
those are the
rooftop
technical details, but just from a fighter pilot's lens, for our viewers to understand the differences between flying an F-35 versus the Rafales which we've just bought, the Chinese stealth fighters which are now out and making a lot of headlines, and the Russian stealth fighter, which could potentially also be an alternative if India is indeed looking to buy these stealth fighter jets.
Yeah, so, on that aspect, certainly, considering that on the Tibetan plateau, the PLAF has deployed, wide-ranging air defense radars, having a stealth fighter to penetrate those defenses is extremely vital. The second element is that of super cruise. And super cruise is the ability to, fly at top speeds and be unobservable at speeds below supersonic speeds. So if one talks about technology, pure integration of weapon systems and sensors, the F-35 is par excellence. Can be integrated into our already complex fighter ecosystem that has Jaguars, Mirages, MiG-29, Sukhoi 30s, and the Rafale. That's the question to look at.
That's an important point. Pramit Pral Chaudhary, we already have Russian fighter jets. We have now French fighter jets, new and old. And now if we go and introduce an American line, the question also of interoperability, given the fact that we've got S-400 missile defense systems from Russia. Just the complications are, is it just too much of a hornet's nest to try and unpack? Or do you think it's worth the effort in the long term? Pramit.
The long-term problem that we will face is Russia. Russia's aerospace industry is dying. And the problem that we're facing increasingly is that they're dependent more and more on Chinese components, which is something unacceptable to India. That's one of the reasons we've been having difficulties, for example, with S-400 shipments, is that where does Russia get its semiconductor chips from? And that same problem exists with almost all of its advanced weaponry systems, is that the Western sanctions means there is no chip supplier other than China, and this is now spreading across the Russian defense system. This means that Russia effectively cannot provide, not because we have a bad relationship with Russia, but because Russia simply doesn't have the capacity in electronics to provide for a lot of these new advanced weapon systems, and without working or living with a Chinese supply chain behind it. this is simply unacceptable for us. And that's one of the reasons we're canceling or slowly walking away from them. So we are really looking, I would argue, for a Sukhoi replacement in the long term. In the short term, I don't think that's a problem at all. But in the long term, that is going to be an issue. Hence the F-35, the Rafale, and so on, where we're looking at. Now, what is the F-35's advantage? The number one advantage is, of course, that it is the only operational fifth-generation fighter, a full-scale fifth-generation fighter in the world. The Chinese have the J-20 and the J-35, but they are not full fifth-generation fighters. They're underpowered, and they are still visible under radar in certain circumstances. If China succeeds in building a full-scale fifth-generation fighter, the problem that we will face is that almost all of our top-end fighters will become obsolete against it. Technologically, they will fall far behind. The French
How far is China from being able to build a fully fifth-generation fighter aircraft which avoids radar signals and is completely undetectable by Indian assets and Indian radar assets?
Correct, and more importantly, our fighters, the Rafale or the Sukhois, will not be able to lock onto this as a target. There have been games where the Americans have pitched their fourth generation against fifth generation fighters, and the problem is simply that the fourth generation fighters can't see the fifth generation. In other words, they can even visually see it, but their radars cannot lock onto it, in which case they cannot fire their missiles. So this is the problem. That's why the generation shift is so important. So that's why a fifth generation fighter at some point will probably have to be part of our weapons mix. And the game is deciding when and how. I personally have my doubts about the Russian fifth generation fighter. From what I understand, Russia can make a fighter that flies like a fifth generation fighter, but it cannot see like a fifth generation fighter. The French have a problem that they need somebody to support them in terms of financing. You mentioned the cost. Actually, the unit cost of an F-35 is much lower than Rafale, not because it's a cheaper aircraft. It's just that they've made over 1,000 of them. So the unit cost of an F-35 versus a Rafale C, which is a standard class we would be buying, the Rafale C is only less than 300 are in operation. So the unit cost automatically rises simply because the sheer production numbers are so much higher. But a fifth generation fighter's life cycle cost is much higher. But as I said, we may unfortunately have the necessity of having to go fifth generation at some point simply because our primary strategic adversary, China, is so close now to a operational.
Those are important points by Pramit Palchaudhary, because the big purchase right now is whether we buy more Rafale fighter jets, Marshal Subramaniam, or whether we expand it to looking at an F-15, F-18, F-16++ from the United States. An opinion there is very sharply divided, as you know. Where do you come out on this question of we need more fighter jets? Which one should we get?
So, I think it's unfair. I think it's unfair to put the Air Force in a spot to choose between the F-35 and the MRFA, for which the global tender is already out. I think the more urgent requirement is to ensure that India's stock of 4.5 generation fighters is able to, you're able to stock up your Rafale class, or you're able to stock up a 4.5 generation aircraft to tide over the immediate crisis, which is, I think, over the next decade or so. But I fully agree with Pramit Palchaudhary that I think we can't stay behind in the race for a fifth generation fighter. The AMCA has been unveiled the other day, but I really wonder, given the kind of schedules that HAL has been maintaining, what is the kind of timeline that we're looking at the AMCA when it comes to a fifth generation aircraft? So I think at some point in time, we will have to look at a fifth generation aircraft. But for heaven's sake, at this point in time, don't ask the Indian Air Force to choose between an F-35 and another 4.5 generation fighter, because what it needs is to beef up those 36 Rafales in the short to medium term.
And there, Brahmacharan, both the other guests seem to be disagreeing with your position, because your argument is that you don't really need these very expensive fighter jets. What you need, for example, whether they are drones or to be able to deal with your border situation. But the fact is, as the Russia-Ukraine battlefield shows, the nature of warfare is changing so rapidly, And I was reading a report that these drones get better every few weeks. Ukraine is able to improve the quality of the drone. So is that really the conversation you think we should be having? Or do you think they're incomparable? Pramachalani.
Well, there are two things. First, as you rightly point out, the Ukraine war is showing the nature of air power is changing. In the Ukraine war, missiles and drones have proved critical. Nobody's going to give India ballistic missiles or cruise missiles. In that area, we are self-sufficient. But do you know how much we spend annually on our missile program? It's only a few $100 million a year. Compare that with the billions of dollars we sink every year in buying conventional weapon systems from overseas. Why not strengthen your missile program? Why not strengthen your drone capabilities? Even a country like North Korea, or take the case of Iran, these two countries are the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. And look at their advances in missile and drone capabilities. Iran just a couple of days ago released a video of a new underwater drone system. They showed the launch of it from underwater. Such capabilities we need to develop at home. But there's a more important thing that we tend to forget. India, by and large, imports far more than it exports.
Sure.
And apart from the US, with which we have a trade surplus, India has a large trade deficit with the rest of the world. And that trade deficit is weighing down India's economy, along with oil imports, arms imports. These two items are weighing India down economically. Now,
Brahmachalani, Air Marshal Subramaniam and Pramit Pal Chaudhary for joining us with your thoughts. Thank you very much. That's a much larger debate. Should we look at an F-35 or any fighter jet at all, or should we instead be looking at more missile systems, more drones, armed drones? Because that's really where the nature of warfare is changing, and changing at an extremely rapid pace. How did this bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and American President Donald Trump go from the lens of the officials in the Ministry of External Affairs? I'm joined now by Meera Shankar. She's been India's ambassador to the United States, a very well-known Indian diplomat. Ma'am, would this have been very tricky for Messrs. Misri and our ambassador Quatra in the United States to manage the fact that you've got a big Trump press conference on tariffs happening when your boss is in DC? He continuously targets India as being a tariff abuser. Was this really what you'd call a diplomatic nightmare in terms of putting together a state visit?
I think by now people are more used to Mr. Trump's methods. So, he generally steps up the pressure before a meeting and strengthens his negotiating position. It's like Sun Tzu's winning without warfare if you step up the pressure. So he psychologically tries to put the other side at a disadvantage, or to soften them up before the meeting. I think.
How did the meeting go from your lens? You've seen the first Trump-Modi bilateral, the US meeting, the India meeting, you saw the Modi-Biden meeting. How do you compare them?
Well, I think there's greater ideological affinity between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, because they are both heading conservative parties, and their domestic agendas to some extent have similarities. So you saw that in the first term of President Trump. Now, in his second term, he's come back with a stronger mandate, with very few checks and balances on his executive authority. And whatever he has promised to do, he has started off doing from day one with a vengeance. So in some sense, this was a more difficult, more unpredictable meeting between the two. And for India, I think the challenge was to avoid the minefields and to keep the big picture in mind and get a sense of how Trump in his second avatar sees the future trajectory of the India-US relationship. to try to
we've got just
shape
about a month and a half
that.
to go before the reciprocal tariffs kick in. Ms. Shankar, do you think that's enough time to be able to get a bilateral trade agreement going, or is that just too little time and way too many complications to actually arrive at a consensus?
See, like, there are two things. One is that the reciprocal tariffs will kick in April. But on the other hand, the two sides have agreed to discuss on a possible trade deal. And that trade deal, they want to get ready by the fall. So you're looking at two deadlines. If the negotiations are going reasonably well, I take it that the tariffs could be held in abeyance to give time for the trade talks to, reach fruition. If the trade talks are not going well, then you have the possibility of the tariffs kicking in. But I think what the two sides have done is to take what could have been a potential friction point and to deal with it pragmatically. Of course, President Trump also raising issues of agricultural tariffs in India, saying that the US has an average tariff of 2% on agricultural imports, whereas India has an average tariff of 39%.
No, but that's an unviable ask. Prime Minister Modi has, I know the next election is only Bihar, but that's like a political landmine. He steps on it. Mamata Banerjee, Akhilesh, Rahul Gandhi will have their bazookas out for the Prime Minister. He can't mess around with agriculture and dairy tariffs.
I don't think that India will agree. That's what I'm saying. But we can buy a couple of agricultural products like we do buy almonds, pistachios, or even sometimes Washington apples and so on. So that is something we can do. But like the US was wanting to export beef at one stage, and we had to literally say that this is something which is culturally just not acceptable. You don't understand the Indian context, but no government in India will be able to agree to this. And similarly, on agriculture as a whole, we have consistently taken the view that this is a political no-no. We have subsistence farming, 2.5 acre farms. You cannot expose the vulnerability of those farmers to international competition with these huge mega agricultural corporations.
Okay.
So agriculture is a no-no. But again, as I said, there are skillful workarounds, if you will, where you can
Shankar,
pick up
for taking out time and joining us. You're saying, buy what you don't really face massive political backlash around. Maybe we can just reduce Harley-Davidson import duty substantially, make it as close to zero, let them export as many Harleys as they want. Let's see how many Indians actually want to buy it. He somehow got stuck on Harley-Davidsons, and it just keeps coming up in every press conference. Well, some of this is just having to deal with the neighborhood bully. You have to figure out how to trapeze your way around his demands. What's going to be the likely impact of the reciprocal tariffs that President Trump has threatened against India? Of course, there will be negotiation on a bilateral trade agreement, but if that doesn't happen, how does this impact your life and the life of Indian companies that export to the United States? For perspective, I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by India's Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, Krishnamurthy Subramaniam. He's been India's Chief Economic Advisor before this. And I have Shankar Iyer joining us from India. I want to go across and show you some data sets which really put the threat in perspective, and then we'll look at the possible implications. I'll start by showing you what could be the impact. So if nothing changes between now and the 2nd of April, and Donald Trump rams home reciprocal tariffs, which means jitna tum charge karoge, utna main charge karunga. If he actually moves ahead with that, India could be impacted to the extent of 29% and be the most hard-hit country, followed by Brazil at 28%, the European Union bloc at 25%, the United Kingdom at 24%, Mexico at 23%, Canada at 19%, Korea at 13%, Taiwan at 12%, and Singapore at 9%. But the maximum impact can potentially be against India at 29%. Let's look at why Donald Trump is so angry. What is the reason behind his anger? So he's upset about India having this $45 billion trade deficit with the United States. But remember, as far as trade deficits go, China is the far bigger culprit at $295 billion. The Euro area at $267, Mexico at $171. followed by Vietnam, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and only then does India come in at number 9 in the list of countries which have trade deficits with the United States. Now, if you look at the average weighted tariffs that India imposes on US products, it's 9.5% after the budget. This comes down to roughly 8.5%. China has an average tariff of 7.1%. Malaysia is 1.8%. Vietnam is 2.8%. And if I compare what India charges in the next slide with America's average tariff, you'll really understand why is it that Trump is upset. So India's average tariff is 9.5% versus American tariff, weighted tariff on Indian imports at 3%. This is the 6.5% that irks him, irritates him, and he's seeking to change. But it's not the same across all products. You know, it's in different products, the tariffs are different, but in India, from the early 2000s, when the tariffs were much higher, they've actually been coming down as a whole to 9.5% from the high 20s in the early 2000s, now to 9.5%. America, though, has been constant. From 4.6% to 3%, it's actually been a flatline curve over the past 22 years. India has seen tariff cuts. So, Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, just for the purpose of an economic war game of sorts, explain to everyone watching at this time the potential impact, theoretically, if there is no trade agreement and if Trump rams home the tariffs he's threatened on the 2nd of April. How does this impact the lives of those watching?
First of all, very good evening, viewers, and thank you, Rahul. Let me first highlight the big picture. I read the joint statement by Honorable Prime Minister Modi and President Trump very carefully. If you create a word cloud out of that, actually tariffs is almost not there. I think, therefore, it is important to understand the big picture here. The US-India Compact, which is, catalyzing opportunities for military partnership, accelerated commerce, and technology, focuses on strategic technology and defense collaboration, including emerging technologies, defense co-production, and interoperability. Climate and clean energy focus, including renewables and green hydrogen, and global health and economic resilience, from pandemic preparedness to robust supply chains. I think that's the bigger backdrop. Also, if you read the joint statement, especially
can I bring you to my question? We'll deal with this. I'll come to it. My question is, if Trump pushes home the tariffs he's threatened, how does it impact the life of my viewers?
Exactly. I think that's the, it's important to read the joint statement carefully. And, two key aspects there actually is working towards a, bilateral trade agreement and the mention of both tariff and non-tariff barriers, lowering that. I think that especially the second part is very critical, because if you look at the WTO data, it clearly shows that non-tariff barriers are far higher actually in the United States compared to India. For instance, whether it's actually on the number of products, about 77% of products actually encounter non-tariff barriers in the United States. In India, it's only 49%. If you look at from a value perspective, 83%, in the US actually, while about
You're giving an explanation for why we shouldn't have these tariffs. So I'm going to come to that in part two. My question is, if these tariffs are rammed home, what's the impact?
I think, Rahul, you have to understand actually, it is the fact that the joint statement talks about lowering both and reciprocity, which means that in the reciprocity and the negotiations thereby, both of these will be there. So I think, your effort to try and actually blow this up, far more is clearly not in the right place. That's what I'm trying to actually explain to the viewers. The impact is likely to be much less than how Rahul is, looking to make this, seem. That's the main point, viewers, that I'm trying to actually make you understand. Both from the big picture perspective and also the reciprocity and the inclusion of tariff and non-tariff barriers.
Okay, let me put that same question to Shankaraya. I'll come back to you in a moment, sir. Shankaraya, just for the purpose of our viewers actually understanding, if there is no trade agreement and there is no extension of the 2nd April deadline, how does the life of Indian companies exporting to the US and Indian consumers consuming American products in India change, in your view? What could be the impact?
Well, hopefully they will have a USTR soon and a Commerce Secretary soon, and then they will figure out what they want to do in the study that they're doing. The extent of the damage will depend on the magnitude of what there is also a floating rumor that Trump now wants to use VAT or our GST as one of the aspects of tariff, and he wants to calculate. Now, we don't know exactly how this will pan out, but I can tell you that sectorally, if this thing goes to, well, from bad to worse, push comes to shove, whatever the cliche you want to use, I think there are 2 or 3 segments which will probably hurt. One is the gem and jewelry sector, which operates on thin margins, which requires the US market to sort of build scale. The other will be pharma. If whatever nonsense is happening there in the discussion, there is talk about cutting down Medicaid, there is talk about trimming the number of workforce, there is talk about forcing pharma companies to deliver drugs at a particular price. So India's game in the US is largely generic, so we are okay on that, but it will hurt the quantum of exports. And the third is a large number of automobile and other companies who sort of feed into the US supply chain for Ford, like Bharat Forge and other companies who sort of deal with these components for the US manufacturers. On the issue of whether how badly it will hurt us, one aspect that was useful to know, Rahul, is that if the price of medicines goes up, it's going to hurt the US citizen and the US government balance sheet because Medicaid is covered there. The other aspect is that, for all the talk about the LNG and energy purchase and all, and then this morning or yesterday, President Trump has also spoken about dealing with Putin, bringing Xi Jinping to the table. He's talking about Putin being on G8. Presumably all this happens, then the sanctions get lifted. Why would India want to buy expensive LNG from
Those are important points. And I want to come to what Krishnamurthy Subramanian was saying. And you're in Washington at the moment at the IMF. And it's a bit of an absurd situation. The Trump administration doesn't have a confirmed trade representative. The Commerce Secretary who's been announced hasn't yet been confirmed. And you've set a deadline on the 2nd of April, extendable till fall, basis which Donald Trump will decide whether these reciprocal tariffs come into play or not. That is an absurd deadline to set. You don't have a TR, you don't have a Commerce Secretary, and you're saying this is the deadline by which we must finish the conversation. At 4 years last time, Piyush Goyal, Robert Lighthizer were added for 4 years. We couldn't come to a limited trade agreement, and here we're talking about a bilateral trade agreement.
I think, Rahul, the fact that there has been work done on this, previously in the previous Trump administration is an important factor that is being kept in, because there's been a lot of work that was, and in fact, you would remember that, that at that point in time, the agreement was near completion. And I think, both leaders are looking to build on that. I think a few months leading up to fall actually is certainly enough time given the amount of work that has already been done. Now, couple of more points, I think, which is really important for our viewers to understand. The joint agreement talks about increasing trade from the current about $150 billion to $500 billion by 2030. I think that's a tripling. I think that is, while you are trying to focus on some of the challenges, I'm actually, looking to highlight the opportunities as well, so that our viewers get a balanced, assessment. Now, when it comes to actually the bilateral trade agreement, the fact that it is reciprocal, I think is really critical, because India has already made the first move in the budget, and that is something that is highlighted in the joint statement as well, the inclusion of tariff and non-tariff barriers. Therefore, and importantly, I think this is something, President Trump, who takes himself to be a brilliant negotiator, saying that, Prime Minister Modi is a better negotiator than him, I think tells clearly that the Indian interests have been really well taken care of by our Prime Minister, none other than President Trump, actually, who's not given into sort of, giving compliments, actually acknowledging Prime Minister to be a tough negotiator.
Now, let's now get into some of the sectors. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, let's talk sectorally, because, for example, he spoke of dairy exports, he spoke of agricultural exports. We've got farmers protesting, demanding minimum support price. All of that jacks up, the price at which the government procures from farmers. These are very politically contentious issues, given that we have millions of small dairy farmers, we have small land holdings. Therefore, if you allow what Trump seems to be pushing for, to open up agricultural trade, dairy trade, that would be politically catastrophic. So how do you deal with a global bully trying to push what suits him, but is clearly disadvantageous for the Indian farmer, the Indian dairy farmer as well?
I think, as I was mentioning, Rahul, in my previous, observation, the fact that President Trump acknowledged, how well Prime Minister, Modi is negotiating with him, clearly suggests that we are actually in good hands. Now, when it comes to specific, and actually in my opening remarks, I mentioned the emphasis on technology collaboration, especially AI, along with, the focus on energy and green hydrogen and the, health and economic resilience. Those are actually the real opportunities that, of course, some of these will have to be navigated. Some of the areas, especially agriculture, dairy, actually will have to be navigated. But I'm sure, our government has taken these into account. The fact that the mention of non-tariff, barriers has come in, it's, in my opinion, actually is very critical. And therefore, the conversation has been expanded in such a way that it basically keeps Indian interests, very much at the center.
Shankar Iyer, this political hot potato, just to play on the word potato imports, but the fact that you simply cannot allow for what Trump seeks, it would be politically catastrophic. It genuinely would be economically catastrophic for Indian farmers. American imported dairy would be much cheaper than what the Indian farmers are able to sell at. So how do you walk around that rupees? Do you see easy wins which we can give Trump without jeopardizing our core interests?
Well, I don't think the bringing down tariffs on dairy products or agricultural products can be on the table. This is the one single reason why there are at least 4 different FTAs which are stalled, UK, Canada, and others. There's also the contention that, we subsidize certain inputs to the farmers. All that comes into play then. There is a reason why the WTO had a developing country and developed country status, and which was differentiated by both currency management and also by tariff levels. Now, I think that whenever this study comes through, there are 2,000 plus codes in the US Customs. And I mean, how are they going to sort of match each code? Say, for instance, that we impose a tariff of 41% on dairy products, and US imposes a 41% tariff on dairy products. Fine, good enough. We don't want to sell to you. You don't want to sell. You can't sell to us. So there will be a 0-0 net position that will come through. But there will be some important things which we want. For instance, our outsourced production of Apple phones or other electronics or chips or something. So essentially, all of this will play into. We've given them some sort of carrots to think about that doubling of trade by 2030 or till $500 billion. I'm pretty sure if we do a quick search, this must have been said at least 3 times with 4 different administrations. But the fact is that India has to grow at that level. America has to want that many products for us to grow there. So I think that just by increasing our purchase of LNG and energy products from there, and by the nuclear equipment for the nuclear commerce, I think we'll bridge some of this deficit that Trump is worried about. You got to give him a win, then that's the scene there. I don't think anything is going to happen on this till maybe August or September. I think that it's
Krishnamurthy Subramaniam Shankar Iyer for joining us with your thoughts. Thank you very much. So you've heard a wide range of experts from geopolitics to geoeconomics giving you the key takeaways from the India-America bilateral between Prime Minister Modi and Donald Trump. The big picture is don't let tariffs dominate the agenda. That's clearly one agenda item, but net the trajectory is positive, and there's a lot else that's on the table which keeps the India-America relationship going. Trump reciprocal tariffs are clearly a barrier, a speed bump of sorts, as it were, and we'll have to find a way of being able to negotiate it without compromising India's national interests. Thank you for joining in this broadcast. I hope you enjoyed it.